Hey guys, Spoiler here. Today I wanted to walk you guys through my Stormweaver Archmage guide. Build I've been running almost to level 95 now. I feel it's one of the most effective mappers in the game, and it's a relatively decent bosser too, with extremely high defense in 5800 energy shield and 5000 mana with Mind Over Matter. I think it's a great pick for late game especially. I will mention that the version of the build I'm presenting today is a little bit more late game oriented. And while I'll be giving you some tips and tricks to help get to the exact point that I'm at, I do want to refer you guys for leveling down to the leveling build on Max Roll by Crouching Tuna, which I'll have in the description below. Going over the skills, first we have Sigil of Power. Now Sigil of Power is actually granted by my offhand. We want to be running a wand and a focus in this build, so in my offhand I have a Chiming Staff, granting the Sigil of Power bonus. I'll mention here, even though I don't have this done myself, that if you quality up for Chiming Staff, it'll increase the area of effect of your Sigil of Power, so go ahead and do that. Attached to it I have Magnified Effect for more area of effect, Ingenuity, and Persistence to help improve its uptime. The way Sigil of Power works is if you have basically the more mana you spend on it, the more this ramps up to 4 stacks, granting you additional damage. So try to stay in its zone and keep that up, especially when fighting bosses or other tough elites. Next up we have our main skill, Spark. Spark's first 3 links I would consider to be core to the build. We have Arcane Tempo for additional cast speed, we have Inspiration to help alleviate the mana costs associated with this build, and then we also have Rising Tempest. Now Rising Tempest may or may not be working as intended. It indicates that it supported skills deal more elemental damage for each skill used recently of a different elemental type. However, if we watch the DPS here, my Arc, my Spark, my Orb of Storms, and my Mana Tempest all contribute to this buff. It's effectively granting me 48% additional damage, which is way more than any other support we can get. Therefore, these 3 are pretty much core to the build. After that, I have some utility in Pierce, as well as Lightning Penetration. Lightning Penetration's a little bit unorthodox, but I'll explain why I like it. One, if you have a map with additional maximum res on mobs, it's pretty effective against those types of mobs. And even though we have a means to reduce enemies' resistances below 0 between our Curse and Lightning exposure, I think this helps smooth out the experience overall and gives you a little bit of pen in all circumstances. It's unlikely you're going to be inflicting exposure and cursing every mob along. Aside from these 2 links at the end here, I would also mention Acceleration for additional proj speed, as well as the Persistence I have attached to my Sigil of Power now. As viable options, I think you can mix and match the 4 of these supports and they'll all feel pretty good. Moving on to Archmage. Archmage is the core of the build, it's why we stack mana. It gives me currently 9% damage as extra lightning for each 100 maximum mana. At 5000 mana, that's a lot. But it also gives an additional cost of a percentage of your maximum mana, between 5 and 6% depending on the level of your Archmage. We attach it with Lightning Mastery to boost it up, and at this point I think I'll mention the most important and cheap bonuses you could probably do to your skills here in quality. You can get quality on both Archmage and Spark. Spark, it gives you 4 additional projectiles on top of the 15 at this level. That's a pretty significant damage bonus. It's, nearly 25-30%. On Archmage, you get an additional 2% damage as extra lightning for each 100 maximum mana. This could be as much as 33%, so I would say quality these up for sure. And the other thing I'll mention here with Archmage is that Archmage gets an additional % damage as extra lightning at both level 16 and at level 21. So, if you buy a level 19 skill gem, uncut, for Archmage, change it into Archmage, quality it up, and then vol it, hoping to get it up to level 20, the Lightning Mastery will bump you up to 21. And bet many of you people already playing this build have spent more money on worse upgrades. So look out for these 2. This is a big and relatively cheap damage increase. Moving on to Orb of Storms, we have Orb of Storms is basically just a little buffer. If you're running into a tough elite pack, for example, or something giving you resistance, put the Orb of Storms out in front of you. When it chains, it's going to be much more likely to inflict shock with conduction, and when it does shock, it's going to inflict lightning exposure, which we bolster with Strip Away. So that'll be one of the primary sources of shock, but also our sole source of lightning exposure. Next up, we have Mana Tempest. Mana Tempest is an extremely powerful buff. It not only grants a significant amount of damage, but it also helps either chain or fork, depending on the type of skill that you use while you're in it. We attach it with Premeditation to even further boost up this damage, and Murderous Intent to give us Culling Strike. Now there's a bit of a kiss curse with Mana Tempest. Its mana cost ramps up as you spend time in it, and so you can see even if I don't cast any skills, eventually this is going to drain down my mana pool. If I'm casting skills while I'm in its range, it's going to do that even faster. So I don't spend a ton of time in Mana Tempest. I use it as kind of a burst against elites and other tough enemies, and oftentimes when I cast it, I pretty much drift right out of its range. Quality on it does help it linger for an additional amount of time. It gives you an extra second after leaving the Tempest without draining your mana, but especially as you're using Mind Over Matter, be mindful of the cost of this, as it is effectively chipping away at your max HP. For our curse, we have Conductivity. Attached to Conductivity, I think is pretty mandatory, is Heightened Curse. Also Focus Curse to reduce the activation delay. This is the only other skill besides Sigil of Power I have assigned to my offhand, and the reason I have it assigned to my offhand is because we can actually use the weapon swap points to get a ton of extra curse duration, curse effect, and curse activation timing. I think it's great for that. If you want to augment it with either Hex Bloom or Cursed Ground, that can be a couple of effective ways to help better spread the curse. Cursed Ground just creates, an area where mobs are cursed as long as they're in the zone. Hex Bloom spreads the curse on kill to affected mobs. I don't think either one is mandatory, but there's something you can play around with. Next up, we have Arc. I like Arc situationally as a skill. It scales off of all the same modifiers that Spark does, our increased lightning damage, our Archmage, etc. But I like Arc for a couple of reasons. One, it's good for dealing damage against enemies that are on elevated terrain that we can't normally reach with Spark. It's good for chaining around corners. So if you hit the first mob coming around a corner, you can chain to all the mobs behind it, and it's pretty effective. I also like it as kind of a burst of damage, provided you have 2 Unleash stacks up. It provides better and more concentrated damage against a single target, but not consistently enough to cast it repeatedly. So we have Unleash attached to it, we have Chain. For additional chains, Arc does more damage for each remaining chain, that's why it's such a powerhouse in single target. And then we have Elemental Focus. We're not really using it for the shock, so it's just a little bit of extra damage. Next up I have Frostwall. Often I forget that I even have Frostwall, but the concept here is if mobs get on top of you, which is extremely dangerous for this build, you can kind of put the Frostwall between you and the mobs, and it'll help create some distance and let you recover a little bit better. For our links, we have Font of Mana, Glacier, Deep Freeze. All pretty effective, but honestly I have to admit I forget about it more often than not. I have Clarity in my inventory. The reason I have Clarity in my inventory is if for whatever reason you have a little bit of extra spirit after reserving Archmage, you can go ahead and attach Clarity for a little bit of extra mana regeneration. Not a big deal if you don't have it, but it's there as an option. Moving on to the gear, I'll highlight what I feel is the most important piece first, which is going to be your wand. First and foremost, you're going to want to get ranks to all lightning spell skills. This rolls up to 5 ranks on an I-81 base, if you could get something like that. Next up is maximum mana, obviously super important for offense and defense in this build. What I think is criminally underrated for Archmage right now is actually increased spell or increased lightning damage as a prefix. When I tallied up all the increased damage I had across all parts of my build, I came up with about 350% increased damage, and in fact, a lot of the buffs that we get in our build is more damage, separate bucket. So a better roll on that would be ideal here. Increased cast speed, obviously a big deal, and because this is a crit-oriented version of the build, I have increased critical strike chance for spells. Last but not least is gain damage as extra. You can do fire, lightning, or cold here. Most of the damage is generic, and it's not a huge deal if you land something other than lightning here. Other suffixes you can look out for would be increased chance to shock, increased mana regeneration rate, or increased intelligence. Remember, increased int inherently grants you additional mana, which is good for offense and defense. On your focus, we're looking for high energy shield and or a high maximum mana roll for the prefixes. It's almost interchangeable on your focus and your helmet with how much energy shield and maximum mana that can roll respectively. You can either go for super high energy shield or decently high energy shield with a good max mana roll. We're going for increased cast speed and some more increased critical strike chance for spells. Now, focuses can theoretically roll plus all spell skills, and that would obviously be ideal here, but it's going to be next to impossible or ludicrously expensive to get something like that with all of these other rolls on it. For the gloves, we're fitting in maximum mana as a priority, and then additional resistances, or int in this case I guess I have. The maximum life roll isn't too impactful here, but prior to Chaos Inoculation, keep in mind that maximum life and Chaos Resistances are both going to be priorities across your gear. For the belt, same story. Maximum mana, tri-res. Just looking for more defenses here. I do have some Remnant max life from before I was Chaos Inoculation. On the boots, movement speed is priority number 1. Then maximum mana and more resistances, the same song and dance. Pretty similar story on our rings. Maximum mana is super important. Cast speed is something that can roll on rings and not on any of our other defensive pieces, so grab cast speed where you can on rings. I have a single roll of dexterity here, and that's actually okay. We use enough dexterity support gems that a single roll of dex across all your suffixes is not a big deal. You essentially exchange it 1-to-1 on the tree for additional intelligence, and then we're just filling out res. Now the helmet and the chests are super important for energy shield. On the helmet, maximum mana is still somewhat competitive, but on the chest especially, forgo the maximum mana in interest of just getting more maximum energy shield. We use Mind Over Matter in this build, converting all our energy shield to maximum. We use Eldritch Battery in this build, converting all our energy shield to maximum mana, and the pieces that can roll the highest energy shield are your helmet and your chest, and for that reason, we put iron runes in these instead of the soul core of Z. I'm just going to call that the soul core of Z. Boots and gloves can't really roll that high of energy shield, so I have soul cores from Ultimatum in here, because that's more effective value. But on the helmet and the chest, with such high energy shield rolls, you're going to want iron runes. I also probably want an iron rune in my focus. I think I made a mistake here. I think it results in more energy shield if you have an iron rune here, but just be mindful of that. Otherwise, we're looking to round out our res here. Fancy. Now, coming to the amulet. The amulet is super important. We're using the Everlasting Gaze. Not only does it give us some maximum mana and some mana regeneration rate, but super importantly, it gives us 30% of maximum mana as extra energy shield. This happens independently of Eldritch Battery, and it actually represents my entire 5800 ES pool. If I take it off, I have none. Questionable whether or not that's intended, but it's super critical to the build, especially if you want to run Chaos Inoculation. You can't run it prior to having either the Everlasting Gaze, or there's actually a budget helmet called At Series Disdain that does the same thing. It eventually gets outpaced by a rare helmet, but you can also get this stat that way. For the Anoint, we've got Critical Exploit on there. Now I do think there are better crit-oriented Anoints that you can put on, or even non-crit oriented Anoints that you can put on. I've gone with Critical Exploit because it is super cheap right now. Distilled Suffering and Distilled Isolation are 60 and 200x respectively, and it just isn't worthwhile to do that. For the charm, I'm going with a Thawing Charm just to help prevent some freezes. The life flask really doesn't do anything for me because I'm Chaos Inoculation, and it's just your standard run-of-the-mill mana flask. Obviously, we have the Chiming Staff in the offhand to enable Sigil of Power. For the skills, beginning with the Ascendancy, we have Constant Gale, followed by Force of Will. These 4 points are absolutely mandatory in your Ascendancy, as Arcane Surge improves both cast speed and maximum mana regeneration, and mana regeneration rate. We get an absolutely absurd amount of increased effect to this from Force of Will, especially as we further stack mana. After that, I would say you have some flexibility here. I tried Heart of the Storm as elemental damage taken recouped his energy shield. It didn't feel super impactful, so I'm opting for Double Shock here with Strike Twice, and I think my 4th Ascendancy, I tried doing Lab, both Ultimatum and Sanctum, and both final bosses bugged out, so I'm a little bit fed up with that right now. I should have my 4th Ascendancy by now, but I don't. But I'm going to be going with Scouring Winds for my 4th Ascendancy. I have heard that Elemental Storm feels pretty good and pretty competitive, so you could try this in lieu of Strike Twice and Scouring Winds, but Force of Will and Constant Gale are going to be absolutely necessary for the build. After that, the tree focuses pretty much on increased maximum intelligence, increased maximum mana, and energy shield, as well as energy shield regeneration and mana regeneration. That's going to be a constant focus all the way up through this portion of the tree. Up to the top here, I do want to highlight 2 nodes in Pure Power and in Arcane Intensity. These give increased lightning damage and increased spell damage per int and per mana, respectively. They are the largest sources of increased damage in this build. I was mentioning earlier we're pretty starved of that stat, but the majority of those stats come from these 2 nodes here, a little bit over 200% in my current setup. So very impactful there. We have Preservation for increased skill effect duration and Turn the Clock Forward for increased projectile speed. These nodes are pretty particular to Spark, so if you wanted to use a different spell with Archmage, you could probably respec out of these. When we talk about jewels, my priority on jewels is actually, to begin with, cover mana on kill. This doesn't do a lot for us on bosses, but it's super impactful in mapping to keep your mana topped off, both for casting your skills and defensively with Mind Over Matter. I have increased maximum energy shield as a second priority, faster start of energy shield recharge as a third priority. Any combination of critical strike damage bonus and critical strike chance with or without spells is pretty impactful, and then cast speed after that. I would say on this tree, if you're a lower level, there are 2 things you don't really need to worry about, and that would be critical strike damage. That comes last. These nodes here, sudden escalation, critical overload, desensitization, and even storm charge, you could definitely hold off on until later. They're more of a perk than something essential. And let's see. When it comes to weapon swapping, I have a weapon swap that is oriented around curses right now, with Lingering Whispers, Master of Hexes, Fated End, and Impending Doom. Until you have points to play with, I would say the weapon swap isn't really necessary, and you should probably just keep all your points oriented on one tree and your curse on your main skill, or on your main hand. As you get to higher level, you can start investing more points in an offhand curse setup. When it comes to the keystones, we're running 3 of them right now. We have Mind Over Matter, we have Eldritch Battery, and we have Chaos Inoculation. And it's probably best to view these as milestones for your build. For me, first came Eldritch Battery. You either need sufficient maximum life to back up the energy shield you're going to be losing, or you need one of Everlasting Gaze or its Serious Disdain helmet to help recoup this energy shield from your mana. In order to run Mind Over Matter, you need kind of an absurd amount of mana regeneration to combat the less mana recovery rate on here. It's pretty hard and probably one of the last things I would assign. It's very taxing on mana, and you either need a high max mana pool or to increase your Arcane Surge or to have a high mana regeneration rate through gear and other sources. This one is, iffy. Gotta feel it out. It may not be for everybody. Finally, Chaos Inoculation. It's super powerful to become immune to lightning damage, but you also need sufficient energy shield from your mana pool to make this feel worthwhile. So that's the last one I added there. Sorry, I know I said immunity to lightning damage on Chaos Inoculation. Obviously that's immunity to chaos damage. But yeah, that should just about conclude it for the build portion. I'll have a planner down below that you can check out, as well as Crouching Tuna's leveling guide to help you get past the campaign and into early maps. I stream on Twitch. Come stop by, drop me a follow, and hang out and jam out to some tunes while I'm mapping up to level 100 here in the next few days, maybe to a week. And thanks so much for hanging out and reviewing my build. If you have any questions, leave them down below. I'll try to get to as many of them as possible, but for now, enjoy this mapping showcase. Yeah. While I still have you here, one thing that's probably worth mentioning, super important. You can actually kind of cast Spark while moving. If you have sufficient cast speed, you actually don't need to stop to cast it. Rather than holding down the skill and incurring the movement speed penalty, you can just kind of tap it as you go along, and the movement speed penalty will apply, but it'll barely apply, or just for a fraction of the second. So you can pretty much move at max movement speed and still cast your spark if you just tap the skill repeatedly as you move along. And there you have it. Thanks again for watching.